Well, why don't we pray? Father in heaven, we have gathered together as your people and sought to worship you and sing to you, honor you in that way. And we confess our hearts are filled in doing so. And we ask now that you'd help us to sit here with your word and profit from it as you have intended. These words are for us, and we pray we would receive them in such a way that that reality is felt and known in our experience, that these words are for us. In Christ's name, amen. Well, today was going to be our penultimate message in the book of Genesis, second to last, but I'm going to split up the message into two, and I have two reasons for that. First, it will allow me to say a little bit more that I think should be said in the latter part of what's going to be this message. I found that part of the message growing a bit, and I didn't want this to be super long. But the second and the primary reason is a certain missionary has sent us a video update, which is of some length. Got that in the mail. The nature of that video, together with the specific requests of how it is shown, means that I will show it today in our meeting. After this time, I'll set it up and we can watch it. I brought my laptop for that, and big screen on it and stuff. So we will do that. Also, we have a very recent written update from that same missionary as well, and I thought it would be good just to, to spend some time reading that and then considering those things and in prayer about them. And so I want to allow us to do that. This is all news even to Stan, and that kind of the timing of this and the nature of it. But when things lined up as they did, as I was considering things last night, this seemed like the way to go. So today I had intended to lay out a summary message for the book of Genesis, and then the next time I speak, we would consider the main ways that the book of Genesis fits into what Jesus meant when he spoke the words, "Moses wrote of me." And that's still kind of the only two things I have left to do, as I see it in Genesis, is one, to kind of give this sweeping summary, and then two, to consider what Jesus meant when he said, "Moses wrote of me," and how Genesis itself, how we see that in this book. So that would be the next message. This message was going to be this summary. And there were a couple of ways that I wanted to work through the book of Genesis today. Unlike the reviews of the shorter segments of the book, we're not trying to grab up every point and remember them all and fit them together and press them upon our hearts again. Rather, I'm trying to convey just the grand sweep of the book and its profound message for us today. I want to leave you with a very coherent understanding of the book. There are several ways to do this, and you might consider, I'll say what was going to be this one message as consisting of several shorter messages, all on the same topic of the book of Genesis, but it was going to consist of 3 parts. Instead, we will just consider the first of these mini messages. We'll have that, and then the other 2 we will leave for later. But let me explain what those are so you know what is in front of us. In the first message, the one we'll get to today, we're considering the most basic of outlines for the book of Genesis, dividing it into 3 parts: God and creation, fall and judgment, and faith and blessing. In the second message, we are considering a different outline for the book. Here we're considering the book of Moses, this book of Genesis rather, as Moses himself has structured it. We are following the Toldot sections of the book. These are those section divisions, right, that Moses himself put into the book as he wrote it. It's the basic structure of the book that Moses chose to use in writing it. Each section has its own purpose and goals, and all of these serve his larger purpose. And then the third of those many messages was simply to consider the main purposes of Moses in writing. Now that we've kind of gone through the book and remembered kind of what's in it and the scope of things and the progression of his argument and what he's saying and conveying and the history there, what he chooses to say and chooses not to say, what was his point in all of this? And what is and then also to ask, what are the primary ways that God has used the content of this book in redemptive history? How did the things that were laid out here, how did God continue to go back to those things again and again to continue teaching and further develop those same truths? And I want us to realize how fundamental and essential this book is for us. And so that third one was kind of primarily a message of application. So with that introduction then, we can move into the first of these three messages, this basic, very broad sort of outline of the book of Genesis. And the first thing you might ask is, if I said that Moses gave an outline, and we're going to cover that next time, and I say, well, now we're going to consider the book from a different outline. It's like, well, why would we use our own outline instead of Moses' outline? And that's a fair enough question. And let me just give a two-part answer. First, the first reason not to just use Moses' outline is Moses never tells us his outline. He just doesn't do that. There is no table of contents neatly outlined which Moses wrote for this book. So there's not, in that sense, an outline like we might think of it. Instead, when we talk about Moses' outline, what we mean is, as we carefully read through the book, we observe certain breaks and certain themes to sections and units, and then he repeats the phrase and he breaks off another direction. And so as we read it, as we've read through the book, and we read it several times, an outline emerges from the text that is right there, that was clearly used, but it's nowhere is it explicitly stated, this is the outline, when you see this, think this and do that, and we're not told that. We're never explicitly told those things. But as we read and as we're thinking readers, this outline emerges. Each time he uses this phrase, right? He takes off, these are the generations of. He takes off in a new direction, answering our questions about what will come next in history between God and man. And he does that after we have learned of recent developments from within the previous section, and certain answers have been given, and we're ready. We kind of feel like we've come to the end of things, and then now we launch off into something new. But again, this is only something we pick up by careful reading. It is obviously there, but that's the only way to see it. You have to carefully read the book. So that's my first argument is, hey, Moses didn't actually give us an outline in that sense, the way we might think of it. So the idea of coming up with another outline other than that one is not necessarily so taboo. But the second reason for using another outline, besides the one that Moses seems to give, is that it's so obvious and observable. Admittedly, it's a broader outline, but understand, we can easily observe this other structure to the book. If you were to sit down and read the book of Genesis, asking yourself about the way it's being written and what's going on, if you were to do that in one setting or maybe two settings, you cannot miss these obvious differences. In the beginning of the book, we read a very poetic and historical account of God's work of creation, followed by a period of blessing and joy. And that transitions, that's kind of the first section, that transitions directly into a scene of temptation for mankind, a fall into sin and judgment. And then we read for a while then about people living on the earth, but under banishment from the garden, as they develop under God's gracious provisions for them. They also act out during that time in ways increasingly hostile to God and to God's authority. And all of this results in repeated cycles of judgment, but also God preserving things, judgment and preservation. And there's a big chunk of the book that's that way. And then all of a sudden, there's this radical change made in the way the book reads when we come to the man Abram. The narrative slows way down, not just for an episode or two in a person's life, but begins to carefully trace the main points in the life of four men. This man Abram and his descendants. over 4 generations. 39 of the 50 chapters of Genesis follow, it's just amazing, 39 or 38 and a half of the 50 chapters of Genesis follow the lives of these men and of God's dealings with them. As the story develops, we witness God surprising us with His grace, His wisdom, His intricate planning of the details of someone's life, His goodness to mankind, His ability to preserve and protect and deliver, His high concerns for righteousness, His willingness to forgive, His willingness to justify. We learn so very much about God and His way with souls and His way of dealing with the world and running the world. We learn so much about God's plan and His purpose of bringing blessing to the world. It just reads so very different. And so it's kind of, you just can't miss it. It's kind of things start out and it's amazing and wonderful, and then there's this tragic fall, and it just keeps getting worse, and then all of a sudden it changes. And the whole book reads different from there on. And so there are 3 kind of rough sections to the book. And so these divisions, as I've titled them, is God's power and creation's good. That's the first division. God's power and creation's good. And then the second section is creation's fall and God's judgment. In the third section, it's all about God's activity, building faith and giving blessing. Right? So those last 39 chapters, building faith in the hearts of men and giving blessing to the world through them. To them and to the world through them. So that's the rough outline. So I just want to begin then with God's power in creation's good and to remind ourselves of the sweep of things in these first couple chapters. When we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to the end of chapter 2, it is remarkable. We should be left marveling at the power of God as His absolute control of all things, the way He's unopposed and unrivaled in His position as God. Just consider a few things. We have, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. You could have spent volumes in that word explaining what you mean by created and how it happened, but it just happened. He created the heavens and the earth. He just did it. And that left things in this situation. The earth was without form. It was there, but it was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. So you have God creates all of these things, and they're just kind of there. There's a heavenly realm and an earthly realm, but the earthly realm isn't formed. You think, then there's going to some other, you might think, well, then another God's going to come in. No. This God, the Spirit of God comes, and He begins to act, or kind of prepare to act. You think, and He's hovering over the face of the waters, kind of brooding over them, stirring them up in a sense, preparing to act. He drew near. Well, what will He do? He just starts to speak. And God said, and God said, and God said. We read 10 times. It's incredible. He just speaks these words. And these things come into being. And we read about, there's this pattern. God says, let this happen. And then we read, and it did happen. And then we read God look at it and say, that's just what I wanted to happen. And so we read about a God who not only has a brilliant plan, but also who is eminently powerful to accomplish it, and then does never make a mistake in carrying it out. Every time what He did was perfectly what He intended to do. That's amazing. I mean, it doesn't sound like He's giving much effort. God said. It sounds like He's expending minimal effort. And the result is massive realities, perfectly formed according to plan. This is the image we get of God. And we see Him, in a sense, as a workman. The day comes, and He goes about His work, and then it's night, and He's done, and He thinks about what He did, and He examines it and determines whether it was up to snuff, and of course it was, and He rests, right? In a sense, I mean, He doesn't rest in the sense we read later, but it's nighttime, and then it's the next day, and He sets out to work again. And He accomplishes it all perfectly. Again and again, all throughout here. And as we were to read through here, we could see a certain pattern and a wisdom and a logic to His way that He has been creating. God says these things. God makes, He creates, He does all this. And several times we read that God blessed. So this leads us to this matter of sort of a created, a good for the creation. He's not just creating it, but He's blessing it. So even when He creates it and it's exactly formed the way He wants, if He wants it to function a certain way, sometimes you need to do something more. And in those instances, God pronounces a blessing. And His blessing is such, when you have His favor, it's such that everything in creation is ordered according to His will and His desires, so that when He is for you, you just prosper, you flourish in ways that couldn't be explained otherwise. You just have the help of God. So He's not only just the one who jumpstarts creation and speaks it into existence and forms it perfectly as He desired and is satisfied with what it's looking like as it's developing, but He also is intimately involved in it, providing it with blessings so that it flourishes. This is in contrast to almost every pagan notion of creation as the result, they would say, of some sort of a war or compromise among mostly evil, untrustworthy gods. Almost every other creation story is something like that, some variation of that. But this one stands apart as unique. God has no rivals. There are, amazingly enough, you wouldn't be surprised if this account about the creation of this world that we live in would describe the sun and the moon and the stars and the creation of those things. They govern our days. But all the other religions worship those things as gods. Here we have exactly the opposite. No names even for the stars, nor for the moon, nor the sun. All of these so-called powers are merely unmentionable in terms of their names. You just describe them as how they function. If you're going to give a fair and accurate account of how the world came to be, you only need to mention God. That's earth-shattering for the ancient world. And quite frankly, it's earth-shattering for the modern world. You need only mention God and speak about Him and His action, His plan, His words. That's it. That's all you need. And then we're meant to see His power, but we're also meant to see the incredible heights to which God brought His creation from His goodness, and the glorious path along which His creation was beginning to develop. It was a very good situation for mankind, and it was a delight to God. We can see that as day by day in these march of the 7 days of creation, we read in days 1 through 5, it was good. And then He did something, then He acted further upon that creation, and that was good. And then He acted further upon it, and that was good. And then further upon it. And He kept improving upon His creation. But step by step, it was perfectly according to plan. The foundation was perfect. The walls were perfectly square, perfect height. Right? All the roof went in just perfect. Everything was perfect in the house that He was building in the created order. Everything was right. Every animal perfectly formed. All of this was going on. Now, everything is according to plan. He blesses those things that need blessing to make this thing run the way He wants. And He gets down to the 6th day and he says, I want to make something here in my own image. And that's totally new. He hasn't done that yet. And he does this. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So this is what He declared. Let's do this. And so then He did. He made man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. Well, if we're going to do all this, they need this blessing. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And He grants them food. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed, and on and on. Verse 31, and God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. So now it's very good. Now it's It's good in a superlative way. The name used for God in all this is that the mighty, mighty one. And this mighty, mighty one has created all these things, and He's done it now, and it's very, very, very good. It's done, it's finished, it's complete. But there's still something lacking in that it's fine for the artist to paint the painting and to do it just perfect. And now he sets back and says, that's great. That's exactly what I wanted. But where will it go? Will he sell it? Or does he truly delight in it? Or will he just sell it for a profit? Right? The builder of the house, did he build it for someone else to live there? Or was it for his own joy? And we see in Genesis chapter 2 on the seventh day that God built this place for His own enjoyment as well. Yes, for our good. Yes, that this whole thing would function in a way that was supremely delightful to us, but to Himself as well. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them, and on the seventh day God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. He gets to that last day, and satisfied with it all, He sanctifies what He'd created to Himself and blesses this day. He inhabits the place. He takes the painting from the studio to the house and hangs it in the primary position to enjoy it. This is what He does. We read about the delight of God in what He'd made. We also read in chapter 2, as it goes on about, and I won't describe it all just for the sake of time, but this garden temple that He made, even within the earth itself, this royal garden and this temple. And we see there the riches of this place and the blessing of this place, and how mankind was invited to come and live there with God, to be there with God, and to do their work in the garden and out of the garden, but to have access to this garden and the riches of God there in fellowship with God and to learn of God, just as the creation had been developing until now. And then God ceased His creative work and rested in it. There is then, now that things are established, a development that is to happen among humanity and in the world. And humanity was to go out into the world and subdue it and exercise dominion and be that image of God that they'd been created to be in the world, in their lives and in their actions, in their thoughts and their words. This was what they were to do. And in the process of doing that, we read that they were put into this glorious garden and had all the benefits they could have, all the joys and the delights and the riches. Everything was provided for them. They were to go out then learning of God there and to take these riches out into that wide world, that wild place, and subdue it. And that was underway. And we see that there was a situation that arose where man was alone, as it were, and he's beginning this process, and the woman wasn't there yet with him. And God wanted not just to have him go out and subdue things, but He wanted him to learn about how God would treat him. And so God had the man name all the animals and notice these realities about the animals, that they all were paired up, and it was perfectly designed that way. And yet he himself, there seemed to be something wrong in a sense with God's creation, and that there was lacking for him. God hadn't provided him a helpmeet. There wasn't anyone suitable for him. And he realized this. There was not a helper for him. And so what did God do? God then provided him with one, so that man would see, when I have this lack, when I don't feel my needs met by God, God will meet them. God is not intending to withhold anything good from me. And so this is the lesson Adam was to learn. And the result is, when he awakes, God brings the woman to the man, and the man bursts out in the first poem ever spoken by a man. He composes a poem. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. He's so joyful he bursts into song. This is wonderful. We see the privilege and the delight of man and mankind in all of this. Things were off to a fabulous start. And then all of a sudden something happens. Next section, creation's fall and God's judgment, right? All of a sudden we get this big shift. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. So don't think the serpent is a snake. That's the word for snake, but we know from elsewhere in the Bible the serpent is the name for the devil. And it's not even telling us the devil in a form of a serpent. I'm not here to tell you that is a definitely wrong interpretation. I'm just telling you that's not what it says. There are other interpretations. I take it simply to be the serpent mainly. Essentially, it's saying the devil was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He wasn't like them. When you think of this being, don't think one of the animals that God made to be on the earth. He's something totally different. He's crafty. He's not like them. He said to the woman, right? He begins to question, did God really? So he begins to sow seeds of doubt between humanity and God. And the woman falls for it. She falls for it. She was deceived. It was all about, the serpent was trying to get her to question God's goodness to her. You would imagine he might have had a greater difficulty deceiving Adam about God's goodness to him, because Adam just learned some about that. You might think that. Maybe we'd be right. But he goes after the woman. He's opportunistic. He goes after her. He trips her up on that point, and she breaks the only rule basically they were given, the only true rule: don't eat of this one tree. If you do that, you're going to die. You've got to honor me as king. If you fail to honor me as your king and your God, there'll be consequences. And so she eats of it, but then her husband was there. He sees it. She gives it to him, and he chooses to, without being deceived, he just chooses to violate God's law, to rebel against God, which is why I say the devil may not have had trouble tripping him up about God's goodness to him either, because he's just willing to defy him. That's amazing that he did that. And this transgression, this high-handed rebellion against God who had provided so much, is deserving of condemnation. And you can imagine, because things were set up the order that God had created, things were set up such that man was to be the image of God in the world, and God's kind of connecting point to the world would be through man. And all of this was to function in this way. It was to be blessed and prosper and grow and advance under mankind's watchful care and development of the world in relationship to God. And now that relationship is severed, the whole created order will never reach its intended end, because it's short-circuited at the one who's supposed to do all this stuff for God, with God. Now they can't do anything in concert with God anymore, because that relationship is broken and they deserve God's condemnation. They are rightly under His threat of death. So how can any of this work? And so this is where we are. And so what happens is, what does God do? Amazingly, God doesn't kill them right away, which shows that there's something more going on. And the first thing He says is to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Right? I'm going to upset your plans and frustrate your plans and your designs forever. You're never going to succeed the way you're attempting to. But more than that, I will put enmity, that is hatred, between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring, and that offspring shall bruise your head, but you shall bruise his heel. And so there's this idea that there will become an eventual champion, a victor, from the woman's offspring who will overthrow all of this and undo the work of the devil, of that serpent. And this is amazing. And so we latch onto that and say, when will God do that? Which descendant, which seed of the woman will this be? And from that moment forward, the book of Genesis, for the most part, is dominated by that question, by this decisive issue. When will this child come? How will we get back to this state of blessedness? There are consequences to the woman, consequences to the man that are not, they are consequential. They are big things. They are not inconsequential. They change and reshape all of life. We won't get into all of that, but we'll just enough to say this. The earth itself not only suffers because it doesn't have the righteous rulers it would have had and the righteous developers it would have had, but also because God places a curse upon it in its relationship to man to work against and strive against humanity instead of just bless it. We still have blessing. There's still things that God has given us from this earth so that we might prosper and develop and grow. We are still His image. We still have the ability to exercise dominion, but there is also with it this curse that grates against it and makes it not just unequal blessing. We have blessing and curse both in this world, just as being people. Now, we go on. So we are meant to be devastated at the tremendous cost of sin, but also the incredible grace of God toward mankind. It's amazing. You think about how far man falls. The very next chapter, we read about a man refusing to honor God. That is, this is Cain, and refusing to listen to God. And then we read about a murderer, and then from him and his family and descendants after him, on this ongoing hostility toward God, a desire to live apart from God. It was one thing for Adam and Eve to be driven from the garden and from the presence of God. They didn't want to leave. But now humanity is seeking its place apart from God. Cain goes out in the waters and establishes a city, and they develop humanity really out there. Then in Genesis 5, we read all about this long list of descendants, and this one died, and that one died, and that one died, and that one died, and they all die. And it's tragic. It's awful to read about. Then we go to Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and we read about some terrible sins that were taking place. And we read about the destruction of the world, and especially of mankind on the earth. But we also read about the preservation of the world, and specifically of mankind in the world. It's amazing. At the same time that humanity has so destroyed the world and so made such a mess of the world and so invited God's judgment, God comes and intervenes and judges humanity and purifies the world of the mess they've made. But when He does that, He also is specifically concerned to preserve the order He originally intended and to preserve mankind on the earth as part of that order. And He brings them safely into that ark and preserves them. Moreover, we learn of this commitment from God to preserve and rescue His creation. For some reason, not yet revealed in the story, God is determined to preserve His order, but not to restore it yet. We read in Genesis chapter 9 about God saying things like, I will never again destroy the world with a flood. I won't do that. And you think, well, why? They deserve it. This doesn't make any sense. And just when you think, okay, there's a fresh start, things are good, we read again about the failure of humanity. That even though things had gone, that Noah was a righteous man before God and walked with God and didn't participate in the wickedness of his generation, yet his own sons were of no account. They're no better than anyone else had been. Mankind strays far from God again with a clenched fist and clenched teeth, and there are very, very few exceptions. That's the pattern from the fall all the way to Abram. This pattern results in devastating judgments from God, whether it be the flood or the Tower of Babel, as not only does he devastate humanity with judgments, but He also acts to preserve His created order enough so that He may later redeem it according to His plan. And He also acts in these mighty ways, I believe, to instill a sense of accountability to God on the part of humanity. And in Genesis 10 and 11, we find humanity united against God, resisting Him, and then spreading abroad while still opposed to God. And that's kind of where we are. And you just wonder what's ever going to come of these promises. And we get to Genesis chapter 11, and it begins to look at the descendants of Shem. And the reason that's important is because Abram had pronounced a blessing. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." And he said, "May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem." And so there was going to be this blessing to the world through Shem, from God to the world through Shem in some way, or his descendants, through this house, through his descendants. And we come to then, well, what about these descendants of Shem? And it gets down and there's nothing very important. We just get nothing very important at all. And we eventually arrive at this man, Abram. And this is where everything changes. Now we come to this third section of the book, where God is building faith and He's giving blessing. And I'll say this, God's efforts with humanity has sometimes resulted, up until this point, if we were to read carefully and we could go and look at those instances, has resulted in men and women believing Him and calling out to Him for deliverance. That happens on occasion. We find several people throughout Genesis 1 through 11 where someone is looking to God. It's surprising, it's unusual, but it does happen. And God's efforts within humanity has sometimes resulted in that. He's sometimes seen fit to bring that about. But the general rule has been that people are generally deny God His rightful worship. And one of those men, who was just like everyone else, was named Abram. And though he was from the line of Shem, and for that reason you'd think, well, this man maybe, because he's of Shem's line, he ought to be worshiping God. Well, he wasn't. He wasn't. Even though he was from this line from whom God had determined to bless the world, Abram was serving at the altars of false gods along with his family. That's what he was doing. But for some reason, Moses has centered us upon this man. And what we find is God appears to this man and makes him promises and covenants over time, calling him out of the darkness of the world, the spiritual darkness he'd been living in, and into the light of truth and righteousness. The rest of the book is about God patiently and lovingly, and with a commitment to this man, creating faith, giving blessing, providing protection, gaining this man's confidence. God intends to bring blessing to the world and to restore all things through a long plan that will include a nation of people who stand apart from the rest of the world in their knowledge of God and in their preservation of God's Word and God's promises which have been made to humanity. They're going to preserve that. And they, apart from everyone else, are going to live for God and represent God. And somewhere along the line, this blessing is going to come. Now, let me dive into that last point a little bit and just show some things, and then we will be done with this mini message, as I call it. Right? So, considering Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, some of the things that God has been saying to them. This is incredible, right? Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is incredible. God takes this man from his idolatry and just shows up one day, probably in the middle of his prayers or burning incense to whatever false god, and says, "Hey, stop that. Listen, here's what I want to tell you." And this is what he says. It's unlike anything we've seen in the rest of Genesis, except for maybe Genesis 1 and 2, where God comes alongside a person and says, "Hey, I want you to do this, and I'm going to be with you to do it." It's incredible. It's something new. We haven't seen this in a long time. It's been thousands of years since we've seen this. The only other thing you could say is maybe Noah, God saying, "Build this, and I'll be with you in that." Right? But that's kind of it. It's incredible. Genesis 15. We come to a place, and I won't go through all the details in between because we're not trying to do that today. But Genesis 15, this Abram is really wrestling with fear. He's terribly afraid that even though he's ventured out on God and he's risked for God some, and he's failed God, but God's been with him. He's grown. He's learning to serve God a bit. But God had promised us some things, and it doesn't look like God is giving him what He'd promised. And he's afraid that it's all for nothing. Maybe he screwed it up. Maybe when he disobeyed God those times, God's holding it against him. What's going to happen? And God appears to him in Genesis chapter 15 and says, verse 1, "Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. I'll protect you. And your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir, just this servant." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And there's this aha moment that Abraham has, or that Abram has at this point. God appears, he's very afraid. God appears to him in a vision. And in the vision, Abraham sees himself and God having these conversations. And it's as though you could imagine Abraham would think, sees himself question God in this way and think, don't do that, like you're asking for judgment here. You don't go talk to God this way. But the reality is that was what was in his heart. He's feeling this way. And so God has granted him a vision, and God is condescending to Abraham to truly deal with those doubts and fears that Abraham has deep in his heart that he's afraid to even entertain and think about, but which are actually kind of governing his behavior right now. And so here it is. And it's two things. One, I will do what I promised, even though I haven't done it yet fully. I will do it. You'll have a son. I promise you, you will. And as far as you messing all of this up, as long as you are believing me, you've believed me, Abram, that's enough. I'm committed to you. You're my guy. Yes, I came to you and I said, if you'll do this, I'll do this. And then if you do this, then I'll do that. But I'm telling you, because you're believing me, I'm counting you as having done those things. You're justified. You've lived up to your end of the bargain, not because you have, but because you keep believing me. And I will keep working faith in you. And this is what happens here. Genesis chapter 18, this kind of pattern is going on. God keeps coming to him again to build faith, to encourage him. But we also find him teaching him things about righteousness. Genesis chapter 18, verse 17. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abram what I'm about to do, seeing that Abram shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. This is God's intention for Abram. He says, For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. So now God is showing him things that are going on in the world that Abraham doesn't otherwise have a right to know. He's sort of bringing him into the counsel of God, if you might say. This is my decision, God says. But you know what? I'm going to let him in on my thought process in this investigative work that's going to happen and the resultant judgment. We're going to bring him in, and he's going to stumble all over himself with stupid questions because he's a child with regard to righteousness. But we're going to grow him. We're going to teach him. He's going to develop, and he's going to be able to get to the place where he can teach his children to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. So come on in, Abram. Let's start talking about what's going to happen. And this is the kind of thing that is happening as well. We get to Genesis chapter 22, and it's glorious. Verses 1 and 2, after these things, this is many things have happened now. God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. And he said, Take your son, that one I promised you you're going to have, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering as on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And think, last time Abram was living his life and God said, lose everything and go follow me to this place and I'll tell you when you get there and things will work out. And it's like we're playing it all over again with different characters and different situation, different time. Hey, Abram, you know that son who is your whole life, who you love? Go somewhere out over there and I'll tell you when it's the place and just sacrifice him. Lose it all. And just, you trust me, I made you these promises. I haven't gone back on those. And this is what he's told. So Abraham arose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and he does this. And he goes, verses 11 through 14. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This mighty lesson of the Lord's provision and of being able to trust the Lord in the midst of these things. Abraham got to the place where he could trust God in ways he had never been able to before. Magnificent ways. They were similar to what he'd done, but never to this level. And then we read in the same chapter, the next few verses, 15 through 18. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will, listen, surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. The book of Hebrews says that God said this to him because he wanted to convince him, to give him more assurance that God would surely do it. God is building faith in this man. He's trying to establish a people who will believe him in the world amidst temptation and will hold fast to the promises and will pass these truths on to their descendants. And he does it with Abraham, and then he does it with Isaac, and he does it with Jacob, and he does it with Joseph. It's incredible. You get to the end, and Joseph is saying, I know you brothers meant evil for me, but I don't hold it against you because God meant it for my good and for your good and for the good of all of God's program after this. We bless God for this. It's incredible. We find again and again God coming to these men in successive generations and saying, those things I promised Abraham, I'm going to promise you now. I'll establish it with you. And then it's the next generation and the next generation. And this is how it goes. So we get to the end of the book, and the expectation is, again, the people of Israel are there in Egypt. They are prospering under God's gracious provision for them through Joseph. And then Joseph dies. But we know, because God told Abraham, they're going to serve as slaves and be mistreated for hundreds of years. And so there's all that expectation. They're in that foreign land now. What's going to happen? What's going to happen next? And you say it's going to get 400 years of hard suffering, for which you might say they've been unprepared. Well, they are prepared. If all they've got is these stories about how God used their most recent stories is about how God used the sufferings of Joseph for the good of their people and has prospered them. And they're getting ready to suffer. And on the back end, they need to trust that, and through that, and then on the back end, they need to trust that God is going to use it for their good. They're to resist the allurements of Egypt by the history they have. Now, they don't have it all written down for them. Moses didn't write it to them before their enslavement. But these stories were preserved orally among them and were told. And this is the thing. This is why you get to Exodus and the people are not crying out to Ra, but are crying out to God, to Yahweh, to deliver them and to rescue them. And so that is, in the broadest of terms, this book of Genesis. Now, next time I speak, we'll consider the book of Genesis again, broadly speaking, but we'll consider it as it breaks down the way Moses writes it, and then we'll consider the main applications and the way that God has used these truths in this book throughout the rest of redemptive history. Are there questions or comments?